Alright everyone, I have begun to write what I think will be my finest political work to date, which is going to be a work on gun rights and gun control, and how to shape a debate that will actually be beneficial for promoting gun rights. So, what I'm doing is in the different sections, there are so many different counter-arguments to the concept of gun control in the United States. I'm attempting to analyze them for how, number one, accurate they are, because in some cases, like with quotes by the founders, you have spurious material that's easily debunked. Well, then that's not good to bring forth in a debate. You got to fact check things first. And also, examples where a pertinent point is nonetheless misused for the wrong aspect of the argument. Of course, it's more than about just, hey, should you be able to bear arms? It's also about subjugate things. What about body armor? What about the concept of self-defense in the case of stand your ground, castle doctrine, or the absence thereof, the right to the necessity to retreat or something? What about specifically assault weapons, so-called, or in the colloquial sense, or actual assault weapons in the military sense? What I'm doing is looking at the arguments against every element of gun control and in favor of gun rights being as expansive as possible, and then effectively ranking them according to how pertinent they are and how well they work in an argument. Now, I've written the first section, and I give 4 examples of types of weapons that are typically brought up in the debate as evidence that the founders wanted people to own semi-auto weapons, ergo, by extension, the AR-15. That's the largest argument that's made with them. I'm going to go through these 4 and explain why all 4 of these arguments are weak. However, they are strong when it comes to talking about other elements of the gun control debate, just not the AR-15 or the AK-47. I'll explain. First, we have the most famous example, which is the Puckle Gun. The Puckle Gun is not a semi-automatic weapon. It has absolutely no bearing on semi-automatic weapons at all. It is a single-action, oversized revolver that has effectively been hybridized, oddly enough, with a deck gun. So the kind that would fire scatter shot, grape shot, canister shot. It could also fire solid balls. It is effectively a 3-foot-long light deck gun mounted on a tripod that is manually cranked. Now, the advantage of this weapon, although it was never in military service, and that's another problem, it was literally never used, so the example can't be particularly important. Only 2 of them supposedly were even ever manufactured. They probably got scrapped. I think one of them got scrapped long ago. The weapon is manually cycled. Its advantage is simply in the fact that it has a revolving unit. So you can preload the powder and primer and so forth, and it was well built enough so that it was reasonably water resistant. Well, on a ship, that's fairly important. And that was your advantage. It was less likely to foul, and it was highly maneuverable. It was balanced on a tripod, so a single person can operate it. The revolving system could then be swapped out, so you could have 5 or 6 laying next to the deck gun and have a whole shit ton of shots lined up and fire them relatively quickly. It is much quicker than a front muzzle-loaded deck gun. That doesn't make it semi-automatic, it just makes it an advancement in technology, and that's why it's pertinent. It shows that the founders understood the concept that you could achieve higher than the supposedly 2 shots per minute rate of fire of a musket. I hear this trotted out by the anti-gunners. Well, guns back then could only fire 2 shots in a minute. There are plenty of examples of weapons that could fire a lot faster than that. The Puckle Gun is one of them, although it's not a gun in the sense of small arms. It is effectively a small cannon. So I would leave the Puckle Gun for the debate about the founders supposedly not knowing that there was anything more advanced than a musket or a front-loading smoothbore cannon at the time. That's not true, and that's why it's important. Second, the Kalthoff Rifle. The Kalthoff Rifle is also not semi-automatic, hence the problem. It does again, though, show that the founders were, and this weapon was developed more than 100 years before the Revolution, so it was already antiquated technology. The founders probably would have considered it to be inferior to the new muskets the British were developing towards the end of the 1700s by that time anyway, that were quicker and easier to load and more reliable, by the way, than the muskets they had at the beginning of that century. The reason why the Kalthoff would be something you would mention is, again, technological. The founders were aware of the fact that it was possible to have a gun with an internal feeding system that was capable of being cycled. So you could have 8 shots in the Kalthoff rifle. It came with the primer and the powder all preloaded. Now, once you expended those shots, you had to manually refill the system. That would take a while. And that's why, while the weapon was used in military service, it was produced in large numbers, and over time some of the old matchlock varieties were swapped out for flintlock, and some other advances and offshoots were made. It didn't see massive amounts of use, but it was useful, and the founders were aware of it. So they were clearly aware of lever actions, never said anything negative about them. Third would be the Girardoni Rifle. This is a semi-automatic weapon. It was developed and used by the military before the Revolutionary War. In fact, it was quite often used by Austrian troops for some time. The problem is it's pneumatic. It is an air rifle. It has nothing to do with internal, self-contained cartridges or even powder and ball. The balls went in the top in a detachable magazine. That's the important part. And the weapon was effective to about 120, 125 yards. It was rifled. It was effective. It gave little report. It was very lethal. And it was used. The Lewis and Clark expedition took one. They used to impress the Native Americans with how fast they could, break empty whiskey jars or whatever. The most important thing about this is it's an early example of a magazine system that feeds into the weapon, allowing for that increased rate of fire. And it's high capacity. It held 20 shots. When I hear that the founders would never have imagined that a weapon could hold so many shots, well, they had several Girardoni rifles among them. There were thousands of them made. They were clunky. The air tanks and so forth were not necessarily, you had to hand pump it, and it took a while to get up the pneumatic pressure to fire 20 heavy balls at 100 yards with lethal power. But it was still an advance. It was semi-automatic. So it shows, again, the founders were aware of the possibility of a magazine-fed weapon, detachable, and high capacity, and they were aware of the fact that it was possible to cycle a weapon semi-automatically. They just were using it for pneumatic weapons at the time because they didn't yet have a reliable mechanism for that in standard weapons, really until you start getting white powder, smokeless powder. That's a big advancement too, which the founders did not live to see. And finally, early revolver pistols, and in some cases rifle variants. Again, if you look at the history of revolvers, it isn't until well after the Revolution that you start getting dual action, which would be equivalent to a semi-auto. You press the trigger and it fires. Before that, every revolver was single action, and for the first couple hundred years they existed, virtually nobody used them. They were technically designed in the late 1500s. But it really isn't until far later that they're in widespread use. Why? Because they were all handmade, custom, and they were considered to be gentlemen's toys. You were more likely to see a crazy noble wowing his friends at the court by firing off 8 balls out of his pistol than you were to see it used in any form of combat. Maybe an eccentric general here and there. No foot soldier or civilian militia ever would have been able to afford one. A couple of the founders were wealthy enough to have that sort of thing made by a smith, handmade, probably the only project they work on for the whole fucking year because they were so intricate and had to be tooled so finely to work. It isn't until later with Samuel Colt and technically before Colt, but his was what really jump-started it before you get useful revolvers and later you get dual action. Again, though, it shows once more the founders were aware of weapons that were capable of sustaining a rate of fire that was greater than 2 rounds per minute. By the way, that debate as well is completely debunked. You can fire more than 2 shots in a minute with a musket too. A standard foot soldier would get in a third, a really good one would get in a fourth, and a very small handful of elite troops would get in a fifth. When you're talking about the 2 rounds a minute, you're talking about people who hadn't trained with them generally. So a recruit that hasn't yet trained and comes from an urban background where he's never used a musket before. He's only used to maybe once in a while having to use his pepper box. You're not talking about farmers. Oddly enough, you're not talking about the irregular militia. You're not talking about the citizen soldiers. They all had hunting experience at least. They would have been better off than some of the fresh-faced British recruits at the time. Which is another helpful thing, another reason why they were able to hold their own. It's difficult to go up against a population that is mustered, that is used to their weapons. That's the whole point of the militia. So, when we're talking about early weapons tech, Puckle Gun, Kalthoff Rifle, Girardoni Rifle, early revolver pistols, and some rifles, those are not useful in explaining why the founders would enjoy the concept of people today owning an AR-15. It shows that over their lifespan, they saw considerable increases in technology. They were aware of magazines, including high-capacity ones. They had a knowledge of pneumatic weapons. They had a knowledge of revolving systems. They had a knowledge of the lever action. They had a knowledge of self-contained, effectively a self-contained magwell system. like what you get with the Krag rifle, I believe, or something. They were aware of all these things. It wasn't just muskets and bayonets and swords. They also, by the way, understood the concept of body armor. Sometimes people say, well, body armor band is fine too. Founders never invented Kevlar. Most of them had body armor. Suits of armor. Chainmail was still in use sometimes, although it's not necessarily great to use against bullets. They had effectively leather flak vests and things like that. Dude, that kind of arrow-proof body armor was developed during the Renaissance. And they had some variants during the medieval period as well that was made of fabric. It wasn't even made of metal, chainmail or plate armor or something. So yeah, technologically, and there's one other element. A lot of these people had military backgrounds or were aficionados of history. They understood the history of weapons back before that too. It's not like they didn't understand that weapons would continue to develop. They were seeing it right before their very eyes. Many of the founders had lived in a period where older style muskets had been changed out for the much more standardized, then modern flintlock process that the British began using because they were British subjects. Those were new weapons. The British, when they marched on Lexington and Concord to go for the armory there, the military weapons that they were worried about mainly were muskets and some rifles. It wasn't all about, oh my God, you're stocking cannons here and we're getting worried. No. They were worried about the muskets. People tried to explain, hey, we're under constant attack by hostile native forces. We need these. No, we'll take care of it, said the soldiers. Don't worry, we can police every street corner. Didn't work too well, did it? That's about all. Peace out.